Hey there, and welcome to today's training. It's one of my favorite topics, so I hope y'all are going to get as much out of it as I love talking about it. We're going to be talking about how to use color to create light and atmosphere in your paintings. I'm going to pile together here a couple of different quotes from Hans Hofmann and point out that color creates light, it creates form, our sense of objectness, three-dimensional objects, and it creates our sense of depth and space in paintings. So understanding how to use color and use it effectively is crucial for creating both light and atmosphere in your paintings. And you want to make sure that you are using all of the possible aspects of color. So you might ask yourself, how do you go about doing that? What's the trick to really handling color so that you can create that rich variation in light and an atmosphere? The answer is really one simple word for all of the above. It's through contrast. So remember that contrast is difference. It's how far apart things are. Remember that value is the lightness or darkness of a color. Intensity is the brightness or dullness of a color. Hue is the color's position on the spectrum of the color wheel. And temperature is its apparent warmth or coolness. So let's talk first about what's going to create that effect of strong light, really broad sunlight, on a really beautiful fairly cloudless day. And what's going to create that is strong contrast, but not just strong contrast in value. That's where a lot of people make a mistake, is they only manipulate value. You want strong contrast in value, hue, intensity, and temperature, all four. So when you contrast all four, you're going to create the strongest sense of light. Now, the opposite of a strong sense of light, in other words, strong, hard light, is a dull day, what we call a gray day, a day with diffused light, a day that's cloudy. An extreme version of that would be a foggy, misty day or a rainy day. On a cloudy, dull day, or a foggy, misty day, you've got a low light situation and it's diffused, it's broken out. It means you don't have a lot of really strong shadows. There's not going to be strong contrast. So you're going to have a much lower contrast, a lower rate of difference between those four aspects of color. So there will not be, for example, on a 9 scale span for any of those four aspects. It won't go all the way from 1 to 9. It'll go from maybe 2 to 7. So it'll be much closer together. And that closeness gives you this sense that you're in lower light. So on a low light day, like this one with morning rain that you're seeing here, the lower contrast gives you a cue that there's rain there. The lower the contrast is, the more the illusion of the rain is created. Do you see how that works? So let's look at a couple of more examples of both these situations, strong light and low light. The strong light means that there's really hard, harsh light. Got strong contrast, strong shadows. Let's take a look at this one. This is a bright summer day, and the strong shadows that are created by almost overhead light coming down on a pecan tree, so that the base of the tree is almost completely in shadow. So at the base of that tree, you see extremely strong contrast between about a value 2 and a value 9. It is about as far apart as it could get, except with using black and white. You can also see in that same section here that there's a strong contrast between dark and dull, the dull green of the shadow, and the bright, intense color of the sunlit grass. There's a difference in the temperature. Where the light is strongest, the color is the warmest. the shadows are cooler. So in general, on sunlit days, the shadows will be cooler and the highlights will be warmer. It all depends, though, on the color of the light. So if the color of the light, which it can be in the middle of the summer at noon, is blue or white, then your shadows are going to be warmer. But if the color of the light is yellow, orange, then the shadows are going to be cooler. How can you tell? Put a piece of white paper on a spot where there's a shadow. Put the paper halfway in the shadow, halfway in the sunlight. You'll be able to tell the color of light by looking at that piece of white paper. Now, in this painting, we're looking at an evening scene. This is a nocturne. And not only does the contrast become very low, you don't have a really strong difference between light and dark in the major areas, but you also have analogous colors. You have a low contrast in hue. So analogous means colors that are next to each other. And when you lower the contrast in hue and you get colors that are just sitting next to each other on the color wheel, you're going to create that sense of very low light. So not just dull light, diffuse light, but low light situations. And you'll create a stronger feeling or mood of that evening nocturne time. One of the things that can be a little different in a nocturne is that you can have little spots of intense light. It's just not going to go all the way up to value 1. But you will have more of that analogous color scheme showing up, more of those close, lower contrast in hue. And the reason I wanted to talk about light first is that light plays a tremendous role in creating that sense of atmosphere in your paintings as well. Atmosphere being both mood, that sense of moodiness and the overall light envelope, but also the sense of atmospheric perspective or depth. So you need to understand the contrast issue in reference to light first before we start applying it to a sense of space or depth. Creating a sense of space, particularly deep space, has been a goal for landscape painters for a really, really, really long time. Our understanding of the visual cues, the things that teach our understanding, our perception that there's a sense of space in the painting dates all the way back to the Italian Renaissance. They were the ones to really first understand the effects of the atmosphere on our perception of depth and space. Look at the work of Leonardo as in the Mona Lisa, for example, where you have really close foreground space and very far distant background space, and the atmosphere creates that sense of the marching back of the planes. So linear and atmospheric perspective, and it's sometimes called aerial perspective, are two really different systems. And I'm not going to get into linear perspective at all right now, because when I teach that, I like to tell people to take aspirin beforehand and aspirin afterwards. We're not going to do that right now. We're focusing primarily on light and color. So they're different systems that build and layer on each other for creating the illusion of deep space on a flat surface. Both work to create a definite foreground, middle ground, and background, but using really, really different systems. Linear perspective uses converging parallel lines. An atmospheric perspective uses the way that particles in the air create changes in how we perceive shape, surface, and color from the foreground to the background. The cue that we're going to focus on the most here today is color. We're going to talk a lot about how color affects our sense of space, because it is the easiest one of them to control. So as we're looking at it, I've noticed two really, really big problems with the way that people both teach atmospheric perspective and understanding of color, and the way that people apply it. And I want to make sure that we don't get trapped in these two big issues. So problems arise when people apply the rules, so-called rules, of atmospheric perspective too rigidly, or when they misunderstand them. I want you to think of these as guidelines, not as hard and fast rules. I want you to remember to trust your eyes over a list of criteria that's on a piece of paper, because your eyes don't lie. The paper doesn't always apply. So let me say that again. Your eyes don't lie, but the paper doesn't always apply. So I see two main problems with the way that most people explain the effects of atmospheric perspective on color. To begin with, it's important to understand right up front, you only get the illusion of deep space when you're looking away from the light source, especially if it's a strong light source. Looking towards the light source flattens space out, since the greatest contrast then becomes at the furthest distance. So understand that our perception of space differs depending on where the light source is. So number one thing I want you to remember is not every lighting situation creates a sense of deep space. This is one of the first places that so many painters trying to paint observationally fail miserably, is they take that rigid list that somebody gave them and try to apply it to every single lighting situation, and it's in direct contradiction to what their eye is seeing in front of them. Don't do that. You only get a sense of depth when the light source is behind you or to the side. If you're looking right at it, it's going to flatten out. It's not going to feel as deep. In this painting, we've got a really strong sense of deep space. The light is behind us. We are looking away from it. The objects that are closest to us in the foreground have a wide range of contrast in value, all the way from light to dark, all the way from bright to dull, the full range of the color wheel or the spectrum, and we also have the full range of temperatures. You notice they're warm and cool colors in the foreground. In the middle ground here, you have a reduced number of those contrasts. And in the background, way back here on the horizon line, we have an area that has extremely low contrast in value, hue, intensity, and temperature. Look at those islands in the distance up against the sky. We really only have about 2 or 3 different values back here. The colors are within the same color family, so there's really only 1 or 2 hues. There only is 1 temperature. There only is a dull intensity. It's not bright, intense color back here. Those are visual cues that tell you that this is deep space. High contrast in the foreground, mid-range of contrast in the middle ground, low range of contrast in the background. Now, in this painting, we have a relatively shallow sense of space, and it's because we're looking toward the light. Physically, measurably, if you were standing there, you could run a distance about almost as far as in the last painting. But the feeling of the distance is greatly reduced because of the lower contrast. There is not nearly as much contrast in the foreground as there is in the background because you're looking towards the light source. You're going to see the same thing here in this painting. Again, looking directly towards the setting sun, the strongest contrast is going to be right there at the horizon line. In the foreground, immediately in front of us, we have relatively low contrast. The contrast actually increases as you go to the background. So it gets stronger as you go to the background. That makes for a very reduced sense of depth. So can you all see how that's happening here? It is the exact opposite of what we had in the first one where you were looking away from the light. It creates the exact opposite effect. The second major problem that I see is in assigning a specific value and hue shift and going from foreground to background. It's just a gross oversimplification. And y'all may have heard somebody recite a set of rules like this. And here's the wrong one. This is what I don't want you to do. This is the wrong one. people will say it goes from light to dark and bright to dull and warm to cool as you go from foreground to background. That's a gross oversimplification, as we've already seen. And as you can see in this painting here, we've got a wide range of all those factors of color in the foreground, and the contrast, the range of those things, is what gets reduced as you go to the background. So don't assign a specific value. Don't think of it as going from light to dark or dark to light as you go back into space. All of that depends on what time of day. This one has a distance that is really, really light because it was a hazy morning. So there was a literal haze. We had a little bit of smoke haze, and we had a little bit of mist because it was an early spring morning, about the same time of year. Then in the next painting that you're going to see, there is a reverse. There is a darker area on the background. So it can be either dark or light in the back. But what's going to change is that you're going to have a reduced contrast as you go into the back from foreground to background. So I want you to remember, the correct thing to remember is from foreground to background, the color contrast goes from a very wide range to a very narrow one. So as we look at this painting of morning rain, you have morning rain moving in off the ocean across the marsh. Again, wide range of value, hue, intensity, and temperature. I'm going to sound like I'm reciting a poem. In the foreground, a middle range in the middle ground, and a low range there in the background. That's what you're going to want to shoot for. So remember, that other system only takes into account one particular time of day and lighting. It doesn't give you enough tools to work with to deal with almost any kind of lighting situation that comes along. So to create the greatest sense of depth using atmospheric perspective, what you're going to want to do is to decrease the contrast in the four aspects of color: value, hue, intensity, and temperature, as you move from foreground to background. Look here in this painting in the foreground where you have a great deal of contrast in this first line of trees against the marsh and the water. As the space recedes, that contrast is greatly reduced. That gives you that sense of a vast distance from the creek right in front of you to the far, far distant tree line on the horizon. So reduce the contrast in value, hue, intensity, and temperature, and you're going to create the strongest sense of possible depth in your paintings. So I want to emphasize this one last time here. Don't let rules trump what your eye sees. It is way more important for you to practice observation. Practice looking as much as you practice painting. The biggest mistakes I see people make are when they have a list of rules and they're going to go by that no matter what is in front of them. That's not ever going to work out well. Trust your eyes. Look for the relationships between the colors that you see. Look for the contrast, and you'll be able to create both a strong sense of light, whether it's hard, very intense light, soft diffused light, or creating a sense of depth using atmospheric perspective in your paintings. But don't create a set of artificial rules that will never apply to every single situation that you're going to find yourself in when you're painting from observation or when you're trying to paint representationally. Clue: this also applies to abstract painting because light and color and depth are important criteria in those paintings as well. You want to have a variety of each of those things in your painting, whether it's representational or abstract. In general, putting observation and an understanding of color contrast to work for you is going to be a game changer. I really want you to practice seeing. Remember, the more you look, the more you're going to see. And the more you see, literally the more you're going to start seeing. Because what it does is it trains your eye to look more carefully, to pay more attention, to look at the subtleties of what's out there. So, I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing how y'all put this to work for you in your paintings. Happy painting, everybody. Bye-bye for now.